Us now with more reaction information about all of this. John Solomon is here. He's an award-winning investigative journalist and the founder of Just the News. John, good to have you back with us.
Yeah, great to be with you.
So this is the promise that he made during the campaign. Voters chose him on this basis, and he delivered yesterday. What do you think?
He did. He delivered quickly and sweepingly. I think there's a large number of people that were affected by these pardons. And it has to be viewed in tandem with what happened just a few hours before that, when Joe Biden felt it incumbent upon himself, not just to pardon his family preemptively, but to pardon an entire congressional institution, a full committee of the House of Representatives under Democratic leadership of Benny Thompson and the Republican sort of turncoat Liz Cheney. That entire committee, the lawmakers and their staffs, were pardoned in preemption. You have to ask yourself, if the January 6th committee did something so bad it needed clemency, should America rely on its findings? Because its findings drove some of those prosecutions that people were pardoned for yesterday. Its findings drove some of the narrative that people made decisions on in the election in 2022 and 2024. And I think this January 6th story is not yet complete. I think you're going to, all right, we saw the pardons of the committee, then we saw the pardons of the defendants. I think the last chapter may be a decision by Mike Johnson in the U.S. House of Representatives to vote and say, for contemporary times, Americans today, and for history, the findings and the conclusions of the December 2022 report issued by the Democrat-run January 6th committee should not be relied upon. They are flawed. They're factually inaccurate.
Yes.
They withheld it. I think that's going to be the final chapter from what started yesterday morning with Biden, ended with Trump last night. I think in a few days, Congress does that next thing.
Yes, that committee produced a work of selectively edited fiction, and it doesn't actually represent an accurate accounting of the events of that day. In fact, they went out of their way to exclude a lot of exculpatory information, to include President Trump's own statements to the crowd that assembled that day on January 6th. The president talks a lot, John Solomon, about the fact that the committee also destroyed much of the so-called evidence that it had gathered. What do we know about that in terms of what has not been made available to the public or has been destroyed or kept from us?
Well, we know some of it was ultimately located. We found that some of the transcripts that were missing for long periods of time and kept from the Republicans when they took over in 2023, they've been located, but the video has not been located. Why is that important? You can tell so much from a videotape deposition that you can't necessarily tell from a transcript. Was the person uncomfortable? Was the word said as a declarative sentence or a question? And so for months now, Barry Loudermilk has tried to find those videotape depositions of people like Cassidy Hutchinson, who, so much of the hearings back in 2022 turned on. She's the one who told the REO Speedwagon story. I heard it from a friend, who heard it from a friend, who heard it from another friend, that Donald Trump tried to commandeer the limousine. That didn't happen. When you finally heard it from the agents, it didn't happen. But how did that story come to be, and what happened during the deposition that led to that? Those are very important things. Those videotapes are unaccounted for.
Yes.
They're assumed to be destroyed, but we don't know for sure.
Also, do we even know the full roster of witnesses who spoke to the committee? And the reason I'm asking this question, especially today, is because as one of his outgoing acts, Joe Biden pardoned all of the police officers, law enforcement officials, who testified to the January 6th committee. And there is some open question, as far as I'm aware, of whether or not Michael Byrd, the Capitol Police officer who shot and killed Ashley Babbitt, whether or not he ever testified to the committee. He's not listed on any public registry. Do you know anything about whether or not he testified to that committee?
We do not know at this point whether he testified. The records that are in the public domain and the ones that Barry Loudermilk has talked about does not mention a interview with the committee. Now, we know the committee was regularly assisting him because we broke these stories a few months ago where you see the Democrats going out of their way to try to get him more money and to get him a shotgun when he failed the background check, to do other things. So the Democrats were in constant contact with him. Did he actually consent to an interview? Not that we know of, but we're trying to get that answer today.
If you didn't interview Michael Byrd as a part of your January 6th committee, doesn't that suggest that your entire enterprise is fraudulent? Wouldn't he be a centerpiece of in terms of as a witness to what took place that day?
if you were trying to figure out all the events that happened, one of the most critical events was a lethal shooting. You think you would, right? You wouldn't just rely on the internal affairs report. But in this case, it appears that at least right now, we don't know of an interview that was done officially by the Democrat committee. And that there's so many other places. Listen, we now know after months and years of being told it was a lie to think that Donald Trump offered the January 6th, the Capitol, the National Guard in advance. And in fact, he did 4 days in advance, by the way. The documents I got from the Capitol Police after a lot of work showed that they offered him on January 2nd, and then they were turned down on January 3rd. And then we heard, Nancy Pelosi, I didn't know anything about the National Guard. Her own videotape taken by her own daughter, she's fleeing the Capitol that day, says, we bear the responsibility for what happened today. We should have had the National Guard here. Wait a second.
Yeah.
I thought Nancy Pelosi told us she had no say over that. She clearly admitted in that video she did. We all knew that. Common sense told us she had a say over it. But all those things were left out of the report, along with many security flaws, many intelligence failures. Why were there 34 federal informants sitting in the crowd? Why was the FBI having so many people in the crowd that day? That is going to be the next round of investigation if Mike Johnson allows it to go forward.
Do you expect that the pardons we've seen in the last 24 hours from President Trump will be his final round of pardons in maybe the weeks ahead? And one area that I think could be ripe for more clemency is all of the pro-lifers, especially Christians, who were attacked by the Biden administration for supposed FACE Act violations over the last few years. Yeah. Is it possible that President Trump is going to step up and offer some pardons to those people?
It's under consideration, hasn't been decided yet, but I think he hinted yesterday, this is the beginning, not the end of pardons. And so I think we'll see more. The abortion activists seem like a natural next step, particularly given that the president has put so much emphasis on the fact that we have blocked political discourse, blocked political debate in this country, censored Americans from talking. The censorship order yesterday was a sweeping and historic document. Declaration that federal agencies and any of their contractors and subcontractors can't do anything to restrict our free speech. Now, we used to think we had that protection. We found out we didn't. But that order is historic. It would be a natural progression to go from that order and his defense of the First Amendment to saying these people peacefully were acting on their conscience as pro-life activists, and maybe they don't belong in prison.
So, I mean, I think it's important, and you mentioned it at the outset, that it's important to understand all of this in context because, President Trump is not declaring that no laws were violated, for instance, by January 6 people. That's not the declaration he's making. Nope. He is declaring that we have a deep imbalance in our system of justice and that he's using this presidential power as a way to redress that. Do I have that right?
Yeah, Vince, you're exactly right. Listen, he knows that when you strike an officer or when you invade, go into a building where you're not supposed to be, that's trespassing. But the punishment and the pursuit of these individuals far surpassed what we saw to people who did similar things during the summer of 2022 BLM riots, and they didn't get any punishment. So the unequal system of justice is really what he's trying to fix, not to exonerate every action taken on January 6th or the mistakes that people made that day or the criminal acts they committed, but rather to say one side got treated far differently than the other. Lady Justice was not blind in this case. These people were persecuted because they supported Trump. And I want to make a correction, and I want to make a fix on that. And that's really what last night's pardons were about.
And then, what is the status of all of the left-wingers who've performed acts of violence and obviously breaking the law over these past years? I remember the 2017 inauguration of President Trump. There was riots in the streets of D.C., including a burning of a limousine out in front of the Washington Post. And,
that's right.
Lots of people were arrested. A couple of charges were brought, and then eventually everything was dropped in D.C., and everyone was told to go on their merry way. We saw the siege on the White House while President Trump was in office in the summer of 2020. We saw, like the firebombing of crisis pregnancy centers and defacing of crisis pregnancy centers during the Biden administration. Do any of those things ever get meaningfully charged or resolved?
We'll see, right? To be determined. The Justice Department has a lot on its plate, just getting rid of the very dangerous criminal alien gangs and criminal aliens who are committing crime in this country or have already committed crime in this country. I think that's going to be a higher priority. But you saw yesterday some long delayed accountability for somebody that we all now know were telling us a bogus story, put their thumb on the scale of the 2020 election. Those 51 so-called intelligence experts who signed a letter saying the Hunter Biden laptop was Russian disinformation when in fact the FBI knew it was real, they lost their security clearances. They lost a capability to make money in the private sector, a very consequential act by President Trump. So he is going backward and meeting out accountability, even though he's focused on leaning forward to the crises that currently affect us. But I think you'll see more of that. Keep in mind the Biden family and other people who might have gotten pardons recently, they are exonerated from criminal prosecution for past acts, but they still could face civil action. They still could be brought before a grand jury and compelled to testify.
Yeah.
The right against self-incrimination eliminated. You could see a Texas or a Florida or another red state prosecute some of these people under state law. As you saw, Steve Bannon was pardoned on federal, but he got taken on in state. Donald Trump wasn't charged under federal law in the hush money case, but he got charged in the state. So there are still other places for accountability to be meted. Not all of it has to come from the Trump administration. Civil lawsuits, state actions. I think there'll be more of that to balance the picture and create a more equal system of justice, but it won't all flow from Trump.
And, when we were coming into yesterday, John Solomon, we were told that we were to expect some 200 plus executive actions out of President Trump yesterday. I saw a lot of executive actions, but I don't know if I've seen 200 yet. Do you expect more in the days ahead?
I think I've been told that the total number of documents is somewhere between 150 and 200 right now in terms of just total things signed. Now, those aren't all executive orders.
Got it.
There are lots of things you have to sign in addition to executive orders, memorandum, instructions to agencies. But there's a large number. He was signing all through the night, and I think more will have effect. Some of the documents he signed is a single order that has, or a single document that has 6 or 7 instructions to it. So 6 or 7 different orders covered by a single signature. But the total number of executive actions, not executive orders, is somewhere between 150 and 200, according to the Trump White House that I talked to last night and again this morning.
Got it.
That's a lot in the first day, but the work is hardly begun. There is a lot of work ahead. And I think we were reminded this morning at this morning's prayer breakfast, and then when the courts opened, that the resistance against Donald Trump is still very real. There are people going to sue because they have legitimate grievances or disputes over ending birthright citizenship and other things. So there's going to be a resistance in the court. We know there are polls saying that there are federal leaders who are going to, in the bureaucracy, they're going to resist the president and not accept his orders. And then we saw at the prayer breakfast, which should have been an ecumenical, nonpartisan moment, a bishop inject politics in a self-denigrating way to President Trump at the prayer breakfast. There's still a resistance out there. And so what felt like a really big, fast, quick day for Donald Trump, and it was, it's still got a lot of turbulence ahead of it to get this agenda through and to check off every box that the American people voted to have checked off.
Yep. And that resistance has a deep contempt for the American voters, Will, unfortunately. Hey,
John
Solomon, thank you very much for all of your excellent journalism and your time today, sir.